Assalamu alaikum students, and welcome back to ENG456. The essay that we shall be dealing with today is titled Of Discourse. Some of you might be wondering what aspect of discourse we'll be discussing, and let me tell you here that we'll be discussing it from all possible aspects. Francis Bacon, as I'm sure you're familiar by now, wrote on a number of different topics, and the one essay that we're going to be discussing today is titled Of Discourse. So let's see what he has to say about this topic. And you see that Francis Bacon at once launches on to the topic. He doesn't beat about the bush, he comes directly to the point, and he says, some in their discourse desire rather commendation of wit, in being able to hold all arguments, than of judgment, in discerning what is true, as if it were a praise to know what might be said, and not what should be thought. So, introducing the subject of discourse, Bacon says that there are people who are more concerned with how much praise they are going to get for their speech than for whether there is any material in it or not. So such people concentrate not from the point of view of making their discourse, making their expression or talk meaningful, but they work on ways to talk which would get the maximum amount of praise. So not for the sake of the talk itself, but for the sake of what praise or what appreciation they will get in response to that. So they do not focus so much on providing solid arguments as on presenting viewpoints which will bring them appreciation from the public and praise and adulation from their listeners or their readers. Some other people, and you will notice that Francis Bacon uses just the word some. He doesn't say some people, he doesn't talk about any specific class of people, he doesn't talk about any social group. He just says some there are, and the reader understands that he's talking about human beings. He's not talking about animals, he's not talking about extraterrestrial creatures, he's talking about human beings, and in this case he's talking about speakers. He is talking about those who give expression to their thoughts in speech or in writing. So some have certain common places and themes wherein they are good and want variety. Which kind of poverty is for the most part tedious, and when it is once perceived, ridiculous. Now he's giving you a number of different ideas here. He talks about speakers who have a few set topics, a few set areas that they are good at expressing themselves in, good at communicating in. And they will invariably talk about those areas. Now, the word poverty, Bacon has used in the sense of something that is lacking. It's not poverty in terms of money. This is poverty in terms of thoughts and ideas. So a speaker who only talks about certain topics, or who will only discuss certain areas, certain issues, such a speaker is a poor speaker. And Bacon calls him a poor speaker because such a speaker needs to have more variety, needs to have more topics to discuss, needs to have other areas in which he can converse. So speakers who have certain common places and themes are speakers who will only be able to discuss selected areas and will not be able to talk on a variety of issues. So such a speaker, according to Francis Bacon, is a poor speaker. And of course Francis Bacon would call him a poor speaker because Bacon has been able to give his ideas on almost all aspects of life. And being himself a presenter who had knowledge and who could communicate on many different topics, he would like for the ideal speaker to be conversant with many different areas. So speakers who have only a set number of topics and areas on which they can converse, according to Bacon, are poor speakers. And he says that this poverty of ideas, this paucity of thought is very easily perceived. And once it is perceived, it makes the speaker look ridiculous because his listeners, his readers will already be aware of his viewpoint. And when he starts off speaking, that is the time that his listeners or his readers will say, oh, we've heard that point before. So it's like you heard things in the house with your parents, with members of your family, or with your teachers when they start off on a certain topic, and you say, oh, we've heard this so many times before, we don't want to hear it anymore. And even if you are polite enough not to give expression to these ideas when they come to your mind, you still block that speech off mentally. And in your heart of hearts, you say, oh God, he is so boring. He's going to start off on that same topic again. So, such speakers are poor in ideas and thoughts. So, such speakers need to have grasp of more subjects, more areas, if they are going to impress their listeners. The honorablest part of talk, Bacon says, is to give the occasion and again to moderate and pass to somewhat else, for then a man leads the dance. All right, now he's bringing in the idea of the dance, and you'll see how he takes this analogy further. He says that the best part of the talk, or the best way in which to give a speech, is to introduce the topic first. First you give the topic and then you explain the topic a little so that your listeners or your readers are aware of the exact parameters of the discussion. And then he says the speaker must pass on to another idea. So the idea is to have a flow of thought, continuity of thought, and avoidance of a paucity of ideas. That is, the speaker must not run short of ideas and thoughts that he or she has to present. So it is good in discourse and speech of conversation to vary and intermingle speech of the present occasion with arguments, tales with reasons, asking of questions with telling of opinions, and jest with earnest. For it is a dull thing to tire, and as we say now, to jade anything too far. All right, now what he's saying here is that it is a good idea on the part of the speaker to add variety to the speech. Let it not be same old, same old. And this is something that you as students are also very aware of. Whenever you hear a teacher starting off on a subject that he or she has spoken earlier, your mind shuts itself off. When you hear your parents or your elder siblings scolding you, your mind shuts itself off because you have heard this so many times before. So what human beings want most of all is variety in speech, and variety in speech can only come about if there is variety in thought. You must have variety in ideas and opinions if you want to introduce variety in speech. So he says that professional speakers, public speakers, those who make the maximum use of discourse, have to be aware of the fact that they need to introduce variety in their speech. Now, this variety can come in different ways. For example, Bacon says arguments, stories. Now, these stories must have valid reasons. They must be connected to the subject. It's not a good idea to be talking about something very serious and then to introduce a joke in the middle. So that, according to Bacon, is just not on. You must have stories, but stories which are connected to the subject that is being discussed. Asking of questions, it's a good idea. The way I would like to involve you in this lecture is that I would, ideally speaking, like to ask you questions and see how you respond to my questions. But since this is basically a video-based course, I cannot see your reactions, I cannot hear your reactions, and as such, I can't tell whether what I have said so far is making any sense to you or not. But when you are faced with listeners, then you must look at their faces, you must see whether they understand your speech or not, and based on the responses of the audience, the speaker must alter, must add variety to the speech that has already been prepared. And this variety can come with stories, it can come with arguments, it can come with questions that are inserted as a part of the speech and which allow the audience, the listeners, to get a feeling of participation. And so these are some of the ideas that Bacon gives regarding discourse and what speakers must be aware of. And then he also says that you must also make the tone sometimes a little light. It is not sufficient to be speaking on a very serious subject with a very strict expression and then to continue in that subject for a long time. Human audiences will not react positively to that, because if somebody is speaking in a very strict tone and a very hard tone of voice, then the human mind can only grasp so much. And since it is unpleasant to hear a human being talking to you at a stretch with a very hard tone of voice, the mind of the listener will automatically shut off. And good speakers must be faced with positively inclined audiences. If the audience is negatively inclined, if the audience shuts its collective mind against the speaker will not be able to have any impact on the audience. So you tire a person by harping on the same thing in the same monotonous voice, and your audience will go off to sleep. Now, that is one reason why I try to put variety in my tone of voice so that you people do not go off to sleep. And if I find out, for example, that my students sitting in front of me are going off to sleep, I am not a good teacher, because I am not able to communicate what I want to my students. So ideally speaking, I would like some feedback from you who are sitting maybe miles away from me, removed in time and space, but you need to remember that when it is a speech that is being made, then you must intersperse tales, anecdotes, questions in order to make your speech interesting. And then, because he's talking about jokes and saying that you can also insert jokes in your speech, he cautions you, and this is very important. This is a very, very important point, because this is something that at times gets carried too far away. People will insert jokes and they will not consider how hurt a person may feel if you add something, a joke that is a personal anecdote. So what is funny for me may be very, let's say, painful for you. And according to Bacon, speakers should avoid cracking jokes at the expense of the audience. So as for jest, there be certain things which ought to be privileged from it. Now the word privilege, remember we talked earlier about Bacon working for the development of the English language. You see the way in which he has used this word privileged. And he says there must be certain areas which have the privilege of not being joked about. These are special areas. And as such, they need to be given a very special treatment. And what are these? Religion, matters of state, great persons, any man's present business of importance, and any case that deserveth pity. All right, let's take the last first. Any case that deserves pity. Let's say you have a human being who has a disability. Perhaps he cannot walk properly. Perhaps he cannot talk. Now, to make that into a joke is in very bad taste. So there are certain areas that Bacon exempts from being included for jests, for jokes. And those areas are religion, politics, great leaders. There are people who are beyond jokes. And if you combine great persons and religion and matters of state together, any individual who is admired and revered by a group of people should not be held up to ridicule, because what you're doing then is you're hurting the feelings of that group. So any individual who holds an important position, politically, historically, in matters of state, as an educationist, as a man of letters, these are individuals who are exempt from all jokes. And any good speaker who wants advice has to be advised on steering away from joking on these areas. So these are some of the areas that he says must not be joked about, must not be ridiculed. And you see what Bacon is doing here is he's laying down the parameters of good speech, of good discourse, by telling you that this is how it should be done, and these are areas that should be totally avoided. Now, after giving you his ideas on what should not be ridiculed or what should not be joked about, he offers explanation on why he has included this portion in his essay. And he says, there be some, and that is some people, who think their wits have been asleep, except they dart out somewhat that is piquant and to the quick. So some people, there are some speakers, to be more specific, who have a problem in putting their ideas across, and who cannot sort of assume control of their ideas. Such speakers need to be very careful, because according to Bacon, they might on occasion come up with a joke that is unseemly. They might make fun of an individual who is held in the highest esteem, because when this is done, the speaker is not aware of what he is saying, but the listeners are. And if the speaker hurts the feelings of the listener, he is not a good speaker at all. So those people who do not have command, or who do not have control over their ideas, need to be very, very careful when they are speaking in the public. So that is a vein which would be bridle. And for such people, you have the Latin phrase, Parse pure stimulus et fortius utere loris, and translated it means spare the whip and spoil the child. So spare the whip and tighter hold the reins. Don't whip the horse, but tighten the reins. Now this is an idea that he has brought out from the field of riding, horse riding. So in giving this translation to the Latin phrase, the idea is to make it clear to you students that whipping alone will not solve the problem. When you are riding, you need to let the horse know that you are in command. If you let the horse run wild, then you will have to use the whip. But according to Bacon, speakers should not allow their speech to get to the point where they have to whip themselves, or where they have to consciously take control of their speech. It should be done in such a way that it is imperceptible, and yet the speech knows that the speaker has control, that the speaker is the rider. If the horse feels that the rider does not have control, or the rider doesn't know how to ride, then the horse will run away. So with such speakers, they need to be very careful on how exactly they're going to present their ideas, what vocabulary items they will use, what jokes, if any, will be included, what questions will be asked, what arguments will be presented. All these the speaker must be very well aware of before he starts to make the speech. So before the rider gets onto the horse, he must have all that is required. He must know how to ride. If he just gets onto the horse and thinks the horse is going to teach him to ride, that's not the way things go. So the speech has to be very carefully modulated. The speech has to be very carefully planned. And another important point that Bacon gives here is men ought to find the difference between saltness and bitterness. How many of you can discriminate between saltness and bitterness? Food that is salty and food that is bitter. Come on, how many of you would know the difference between something that is salty and something that is bitter? None of you? Let me explain. Salt is good for the body. So you have to add salt to your food. And certain salts, you know, are very essential for the body. You have sodium chloride, that's the most common salt that is used. It's very important. But if you have high blood pressure, the same salt can be harmful for you. So you have to know exactly how much sodium the body needs. But you know that the body does need salt. So speech must be salty, must have a sprinkling of salt, but it must not be bitter, because bitterness is something that you cannot swallow. And can you think of anything that is bitter? You know, lemon and lime in the pure form are bitter. And you might try to lick a bit, but if you try to drink the juice, you will not be able to drink it, apart from the fact that it's going to cause you acidity. So you must have jokes in your speech, but they should be proportionate, they should be appropriate. Do not start to speak on topics that would hurt your audience. Do not write about something that would hurt your readers. So salt is compulsory, but avoid bitterness. Avoid things that are unpleasant and that are unpleasant to your readers or your listeners. All right? So certainly he that hath a satirical vein, as he maketh others afraid of his wit, so he had need be afraid of others' memory. Now this again is something that is very frequently quoted. Bacon says, those who make fun of others need to remember that people have long memories. So if I make fun of you today, tomorrow you would turn around and make fun of me. So those who have a tendency to be satirical, to ridicule people, to make fun of other people, need to remember that people have long memories and human beings do not forget. And if you make fun of someone, you will also leave the door open for that individual to make fun of you at some point in your life. So those of you who are fond of making fun of friends, colleagues, class fellows, be very careful, because the day you make a slip, your friends, your class fellows and colleagues will turn around and they will attack you, because if you can make fun of other people, then so can other people make fun of you. So be very, very careful. And then Bacon presents a slightly different idea. And he says, he that questioneth much shall learn much and content much, but especially if he apply his questions to the skill of the persons whom he asketh. For he shall give them occasion to please themselves in speaking, and himself shall continually gather knowledge. Remember, he said something about asking questions. Now these are questions that again you need to be very careful about. Throughout this essay and other essays, the one thing that Bacon reiterates, that the one thing that Bacon repeats over and over again is be careful, be very careful, take care. Here also he says, when he talks about adding questions to your speech, he says, remember, when you're asking questions, ask a question to which an individual knows the answer. Don't ask questions to expose others' ignorance or others' lack of information. Question them about things that they know. It's not an intelligent move to ask a question when you know that the other person does not know the answer. It might make you feel very important. Oh, I've exposed so and so. Or, oh, he doesn't know anything at all. But it will not add to your knowledge base. What will add to your knowledge base is when you ask an intelligent question and the individual is able to respond to that question. So in other words, ask questions to which your listeners will be able to answer, because that will fulfill a two-way purpose. You'll be killing two birds with one stone. One, you'll increase your knowledge base. The second is you'll make that person happy. Because if you ask a question and your listener does not know the answer, he will feel very negatively towards you because you have exposed his ignorance. Whereas if you ask him about something which is his speciality, it will make that person happy. So for example, we've had a number of lectures on Bacon's essayistic style, and with each essay I've been telling you this is the kind of essay that Bacon has been writing, or this is the kind of technique he's using in this essay. Now if I were to start asking you what is Emerson's style of writing, or how would you describe it, would that make you feel happy? No, because we have not done Emerson. But if I ask you what are Bacon's ideas on studies, or what does Bacon think of married life and single life, you will be able to respond, because these are topics that we have discussed in class. And so I'm sure if I ask you, what does Bacon think of studies? A number of you will raise your hands and say, oh teacher, I know the answer to that, because you've done that. So it's not a very intelligent move on the part of the speaker to question about something that the listener does not have knowledge of. So you ask questions not to expose the other's ignorance, but to add to your knowledge base and to give the other the other person the feeling that he knows something that you want to know. So you make him happy, you make yourself happy, because he has been asked about something which is his expertise, and you have added to your knowledge base. So this is something that you need to be very careful about, particularly those of you who are keen to go into the teaching side later, or who want to come into professional life. You people will have to be very careful that when you are, let's say, interviewing, or when you are talking to people, you do not expose their ignorance. So let his questions not be troublesome, for that is fit for a poser. A person who asks questions to which he knows the answer and to which the listener does not know the answer is only trying to impress, is not adding to anyone's knowledge base, is not doing anyone a good turn, is only wasting his own time and wasting the time of his listeners, because by exposing their ignorance, he will only get a feeling of greatness that is very selfish, and which will not be appreciated by anyone else. So he might feel happy, but the listeners will not feel happy, and he will only expose himself as being a very artificial speaker. He that questioneth much shall learn much and content much. So he has to be very, very careful on what exactly he's going to question about. and let him be sure to leave other men their turns to speak. Now that's another thing that you people need to be very careful about. I know in this class I'm the only one who's speaking, but then that is the dictate of the program that we both are a part of, you as student and I as teacher. Ideally speaking, I would give you talking time also. And that is what Bacon says is very necessary for a speaker. He must give time to other people to speak. He must not hog all the time. It must not be in a monotone. It must not be one person's voice that is being heard all the time. Let other voices be heard. So if there be any that would reign and take up all the time, let him find means to take them off and to bring others on, as musicians used to do with those that dance too long galliards. Okay, now remember that reference that Bacon made to dance earlier? If you bring that analogy here, you'll be able to see how it fits in with the way that Bacon presents this subject of discourse. Now, a person who is speaking all the time and is not allowing other people to speak, he compares to a dancer who is on the floor and will not get off the floor. So what is done in such a case? That is, when you have a dancer who occupies the dance floor and who will not go away, such a person becomes obnoxious. He is selfish, that's for sure. Not only is he selfish, but he becomes obnoxious because other people want to come onto the floor, other people want to dance also. But because this person has been occupying the floor for a long time, he is thus denying other people the chance to dance. And such a person, when he becomes obnoxious, there's only one way to take care of it, and that is to ask the musicians to stop the music. When the music stops, everyone leaves the floor. Those are the basic rules of the dance floor. Whenever the music stops, everyone leaves the floor, and then you come back again. So what he's saying, in other words, is that if you have, for example, a public address system, a PA system, switch off the PA system. Now, of course, Bacon is writing at a time when there were no public address systems. But you need to have some way of stopping the speaker. And these days, the easiest way is to switch off the microphone. Once you switch off the microphone, you'll see that the speaker will stop at once. Otherwise, it's very difficult to stop people once they've started talking. And mind you, I'm a teacher, I should know. When I start speaking, it's very difficult to make me stop. And it's only a glance at the clock that tells me that my time to speak has come to an end, and now it is someone else's turn. If you dissemble sometimes your knowledge of that you are thought to know, you shall be thought another time to know that you know not. Now you've got to work around Bacon's use of that and you and your. Okay, but we'll come back to that. Speech of a man's self ought to be seldom and well chosen. He's giving you 2 points here. One is, if you dissemble, if you pretend and you do not have knowledge, you need to be very careful. I'm not pretending. Yes, I do have the required degrees. I have studied literature, I have studied Bacon and the other essayists, but I know my limitations. So if I say, oh, I can teach anything, then I am running the risk of being asked to teach a subject that I cannot. So if you dissemble sometimes your knowledge of that you are thought to know, you shall be thought another time to know that you know not. So if I say that I have a degree in literature and I can teach any subject, you could come up to me and say, all right, teacher, I have this text by a very little known writer, please explain it to me. I might not be able to do it, but because I have pretended knowledge of everything, I have said or I have claimed that I have mastered all literature, I do run this risk. So what I do is I play safe and I say this is my area of specialization. Anything outside that, I'll try to explain. Now that is a very diplomatic approach. I cannot possibly have read all the literature that is produced in the world. I can't possibly do that. So I take a safe way out and I say, all right, I have studied literature, but I'll need to see the text before I can teach it. And that will make sure that I do not land myself into trouble. I will not make claims that I cannot support. So that is something that Bacon says is compulsory. All speakers, all public speakers particularly, need to be very careful about this. If you pretend knowledge to something, you have to be ready to support that claim. So don't make claims that are blanket statements. Don't say I know everything or I know nothing. Always tailor your words, your speech to the occasion, the time, and the audience. If you pretend to have knowledge of something that you do not know, then you run the risk of being asked to explain something that you should know. Okay, that's one point. And then we come to the second point that he has given here in this slide, and that is speech of a man's self ought to be seldom and well chosen. Now I know I've given you a lot of examples here, a lot of personal examples. What Bacon says is that personal examples, speech of a man's self, the I problem, you know, most of us have the I problem, and that's not related to the I, to the seeing eye, but to the letter I, me, mine. Everything that I say is more important than what you say or what anybody else says. So we have to deal with our own I problems on an individual level. If at all the speaker does talk about his own experiences or his own personality, those references need to be very few and they need to be chosen very, very carefully. So, speech of a man's self ought to be seldom and well chosen. And then he gives examples from his own life, examples from people that he met as a courtier, as a jurist, as a theologian, as a philosopher. And he says, I knew one was wont to say in scorn, he must needs be a wise man, he speaks so much of himself. And there is but one case where a man may commend himself with good grace, and that is in commending virtue in another, especially if it be such a virtue whereunto himself pretendeth. Don't be confused by the language that Bacon is using here. He uses the English that was being used in the Renaissance age. But if you break it down, the structures that he is using are not complex or complicated. So he says, I knew of one person who used to make fun of a particular speaker and says, you know, so-and-so talks so much about himself. He must be a very wise person. Now, this is not a statement that should be taken seriously. This is a statement that is being given to ridicule another person. And this is one reason why you must not speak only of yourself. And then Bacon clarifies this point a little, and he says, the best speaker is one who praises virtue in his listener, not in himself. Virtue is something that is perceived. It's not something that you can keep hidden. But if you go on speaking of yourself and you go on speaking of what you can do and what you have done and what you have, that I problem that I talked about earlier, that comes in. And when you have an I problem, then you are the only person who praises himself. The world will not praise you. The world will not appreciate you, for the simple reason that you are singing your own praises. You are blowing your own trumpet. You're telling the world this is what you can do. But you need to take that I out and show through your speech, through your actions, how good you are. The best way that you can do it, according to Bacon, is by praising something that another individual has done, by praising the speech of another individual, not by praising yourself, not by appreciating yourself, but by appreciating qualities, characteristics, features in another human being. So speech of touch towards others should be sparingly used, for discourse ought to be as a field without coming home to any man. So you need to be very, very careful in what exactly you are saying, because whatever you're saying today might come back home to you tomorrow. Whatever you claim today, you might be asked to validate that claim tomorrow. I knew two noblemen of the west part of England, and here he's giving you an example from his own life, whereof the one was given to scoff, but kept ever royal cheer in his house. The other would ask those who had been at the other's table, tell truly, was there never a flout or dry blow given? To which the guest would answer, such and such a thing passed. The Lord would say, I thought he would mar a good dinner. Now, the example that he's giving here is of two noblemen living in the west part of England, both of whom Francis Bacon was very familiar with. And he says one was a very good host in the sense that he had lavish parties and he would invite everyone to his house, and free food and drink was available for everyone. But this person would not spare anyone, would call people to his house and then would say, this is what you do wrong, this is how you should not be eating, eat this, don't eat that because it is not good for you. Now, when you call a person to your house as a guest, you need to do more than put food before him. Those of you out there who think that you can bring in lots of things and put them in front of your guest and then start making personal comments on the guest's appearance or his speech or his table manners, are not being good hosts. According to Bacon, you need to be polite, you need to be very considerate about the feelings of your guest. You must not offend the feelings of your guest. It doesn't make any difference if you put 20 different dishes in front of your guest. If you are rude, if you are impolite, all that food will turn to ash in the mouth of your guest, and the guest will never ever praise your hospitality. The simple reason being, hospitality is more than putting food before a guest. So these two noblemen, Bacon knows them personally, and he talks about them and he says, one would put a lot of dishes in front of you, the other would be very polite. If you went to his house, he would not be able to give you a lot of things to eat, but he would always make you feel comfortable, make you feel at home. So discretion of speech is more than eloquence. Now this is a very important point. Discretion of speech. It's not just being eloquent. You must be agreeable. You must not hurt the feelings of your listeners. Because when you hurt the feelings of your listeners, you are not being hospitable. It's rude. It's insulting behavior. And that's something that not only speakers, but you and I need to be very careful about. We need to use good words. We don't need to impress anyone except by our manner and our attitude. And our manner and attitude are both reflected in our speech. So So discretion of speech is more than eloquence. You don't need big words to impress your listeners. You need good ideas. You need good thoughts. You need to have a welcoming approach. You need to be flexible. Take in other people's ideas. Not just go on and on with what you think or what you said or what you did. There is where you have that I problem that I talked about earlier. So we need to be very careful that we don't give in to this I problem. You need to be very considerate of the feelings of others. You need to take care of others' emotions, others' sentiments. Other people have a greater claim on us than we have on ourselves. A good continued speech, Bacon says, without a good speech of interlocution shows slowness. And a good reply or second speech without a good settled speech shows slowness and weakness. So what he's bringing here is a speech that is delivered in response to another speech, a conversation almost that is taking place. A good continued speech, he says, must be delivered in such a way that it is very clearly expressed. There must not be any mumbling of no, 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 no. You can't do that. You go doing that and you cannot make your ideas settle in the mind of your listener. You must be very clear in your speech. Each word must be clearly enunciated. Each idea must be expressed in words that are easy for your listeners to understand. Again, using big words will not make your speech impressive. What will make your speech impressive is if you communicate in words and language that your listeners can understand. You use big words, flowery language, it will go across and above your listeners. And your listeners will not consider you a good speaker. They'll say, oh yes, he used a few big words, but that was it. We didn't understand what he was trying to say. So he's not our kind of a person. As a speaker, you don't want that response. You want a response in which people say, so-and-so knows his subject. So-and-so can deliver a good speech on this subject. So-and-so is a wonderful speaker. These are things that you want to hear about yourself. You don't want to hear so-and-so, mumbles, I couldn't understand anything. Oh, he's a hopeless speaker. You don't want to hear those things. What you do want to hear is, oh, he's a wonderful speaker. He has great ideas. He can communicate his ideas. That's the kind of comments that you want to hear. So if you do not have good ideas, your speech will be shallow and lack depth. You will not be considered a good speaker. As we see in beasts, and then he brings in the example of animals. And he says, those that are weakest in the course, when you are running a race, are yet nimblest in the turn. They may not start off very fast, but they will get there. Remember the story of the tortoise and the hare? And you see the hare making leaps and bounds and then going off to sleep. And the tortoise, slow and steady. He keeps on moving. He doesn't stop. Even when he sees the hare sleeping under a tree, he moves past him and he continues. And it's not the hare who won the race. It was the tortoise, slow and steady, who won the race. And the hare just woke up in the evening and he said, oh, the tortoise is probably far away. Let me get to the finish point. And when he got to the finish point, he found the tortoise already there. So you don't want to end up there. Good speakers are slow and steady. They don't do things in fits and starts. So you need to make very sure that whatever you are expressing is not going above the heads of your audience, or you're not using words and vocabulary items that your readers and your audience will not be able to understand. All right, now to recapture today's lecture, let me go over some of the points that Bacon makes in this essay on discourse. If you remember, he starts off with giving a brief description of discourse, of speech, and of communication in writing and oral. And he gives you different examples of the kind of speech that will that will make a positive impression on the audience, and the kind of speech that will leave a very negative impression on the audience. And as a part of what a good speech entails, Bacon says that you must not only talk of yourself, but you must try to involve the audience try to involve your listener in your speech, and try to ensure that all people present have the chance to speak. It is only then that you will be termed a good speaker. If you hog all the time, if you are speaking all the time and you do not allow other people to get a word in edgeways, you will not be termed a good speaker. A good speaker needs to involve the audience, needs to ask questions, needs to offer arguments, and maybe add a joke or two to his speech. And while on the topic of jokes, Bacon says that there are a few fields that are exempt from jokes in the public, and he gives you those different fields, and he says there must be no jokes on religion, there must be no jokes on great persons or leaders, there must be no jokes regarding the political situation of a country, there must be no jokes about something that is important for one individual at that moment, and there must never be any jokes about any physical or mental disability or deficiency that a listener might have. That is something that is despicable and that must not at any point be done. So the speaker needs to be very aware of the demands of his audience, the nature of his audience, and the preferences of the audience. So it's not easy to be a good speaker. According to Bacon, the speaker needs to keep so many things in his mind. He must make his speech interesting. It must not be boring and monotonous, because the listeners are just going to shut their minds to whatever is being said. And that's not what the speaker wants. So the speaker must make his speech as interesting as possible by involving his audience and by asking questions that are intelligent and yet do not expose the ignorance of the listener. So in order to involve the audience, Bacon advocates the use of questions, but these questions must be such that they do not expose the ignorance of the audience or the listeners, but they serve to sort of give a feeling of contributing something. And this will fill a two-way purpose. It will make you as the speaker aware of a lot of things that are going on around you. It will increase your knowledge base, and it will also give your listener a good feeling of having contributed something. So that is all from for Bacon's essay on discourse, and we'll be discussing a couple of other topics before we move on to the next essays that I have in line for you, and that is Charles Lamb. So thank you for being very patient today, and Allah Hafiz until the next time.